Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
There should be a PowerPoint that's up, and I guess I could do that. Okay, good. All right, well, so my group that we call the Ocean Circulation Lab, we've been running this very high resolution model of Tampa Bay and vicinity. And through the Restore Act, we were able to take an existing model and actually make it into a Nowcast forecast model. And so let's see what we did. So first of all, our team members consist of people from the College of Marine Science, Pinellas County, and Florida Fish and Wildlife for HAB monitoring. And so the names are all listed. You've met the USF contingent, and Kate Hubbard at FWC runs their harmful algal bloom group, and Matt Garrett is the lead seagoing guy. Kate's equivalent of Jay Law. And so that's the team. And so let me give you a brief overview. We have a project that was organized into 2 phases with a total of 7 milestones. Only one of these, the coupled waves, became a millstone, although we do remain committed to it, and we will eventually bring this to completion for a variety of reasons that I'll talk about, but we have had trouble with that one, and we're not quite there yet. Along with achieving all but one of these milestones, the project has led to other interdisciplinary opportunities, allowing it to continue and expand into the future. So this is not the end of the project, it's actually the beginning. Societal applications beyond what was proposed were also engaged, and we anticipate such engagements continuing to grow into the future. So in summary, we are pleased with the outcomes, and we appreciate the opportunity from the Restore Act and from Pinellas County, and we hope that you'll be pleased with the outcomes as well. So let's see what we did. First, I'm going to list the phases and the milestones, and you can see that the first one is to implement the existing Tampa Bay vicinity model and perform hindcasts, which we did. The next one is to nest the Tampa Bay model into our West Florida coastal ocean model, the idea being to produce a Nowcast forecast model versus something that can only be used for hindcasts. So we completed that. The next one was to go ahead and actually implement it and test it, which we did. So that's the third milestone. The fourth one is the hang up. So the fourth one was to continue running this, which we've done, but to add a coupled wave model component. We had done this before, so we were kind of confident that it wouldn't be any issue, but as it turned out, it was. And we basically use public domain model codes. We're not model developers, we're model users. And the whole modeling enterprise changed probably about two or three decades ago when community models became popular. By a community model, I mean that there's an originator that forms a group, and within that group, people start using that model, and through multiple use by multiple groups, the model gets to be very well tested and improved, and it winds up being a really wonderful tool for a wide variety of people that might not by themselves be numerical modelers or numerical model originators. They become numerical model users. The first of these that became really popular was called POM, the Princeton Ocean Model. And then came another one called ROMS, Regional Ocean Model System. And the one we use is called FVCOM, which is the finite volume community ocean model. And there are similarly, there are community models in the wave regime. And the one that we've used in the past is called SWAN. And we were going to use SWAN here, but it turned out that the SWAN code was modified, as happens from time to time. And when we tried to implement it, we had implemented it previously without any issues. But when we tried to do it now, we had some issues with the change in the code. And we eventually abandoned that when the FVCOM group implemented a coupled circulation wave model. So that required that we do a couple of things. The first one was to transform from using their version 2.7 to the newest version 4.3. 2.7 didn't have the wave component in it. 4.3 did. You know, there are certain changes. So we went ahead and we hired another senior modeling person, Dr. Sun, who's experienced with FVCOM. We implemented the new code, which required that we do certain things. And so that's been running in parallel now with our original version for a little over a year. We're quite satisfied with the performance of the new model. The new model actually has even higher resolution than the older version of WFCOM, and we'll eventually transition to it. And then the next step was to switch on the waves, which we did. And we found that there were a couple of issues with it. And we solved a few of those, but we haven't been able to solve the one associated with adding the input to our regional model that comes from the deeper Gulf of Mexico. So, you know, you have wind waves and swell. The wind waves are what are generated locally. So that's not a problem. We can generate those just fine. But the swell are also important. And so we have to input those along the open boundary. And we found some issues with the open boundary coupling that has to do with the details of the coupling between the circulation and the waves. So the waves aren't independent of the circulation. And so we still have to work that out. And we finally engaged the providers themselves, and they're helping us with it. So we'll have a solution to this, but we don't quite have it yet. And that's been a little disappointing. But other than that, we did complete all of the other milestones. Okay, milestone 5 was to quantitatively gauge the Nowcast forecasts that we're making against available observations. And you'll see some of those results. Milestone 6 was to make all of the model products freely available to the public and other agencies on the internet, which we've done. 7 is to engage in public outreach and educational activities, which we've done and we continue to do. So you'll see examples of all of this as we go on. All right, so let's discuss what the model actually is. And there are 2 of them that are involved. And so in the bottom left-hand panel, you see the domain of our West Florida coastal ocean model. So it goes from west of the Mississippi River to south of the Florida Keys. All of those green dots are places where we input fresh water. So those are river nodes. And we get that information from USGS. The red dots are places where we actually have some observations to quantitatively compare against the WFCOM output. We've been doing that for years. We have multiple publications, and we've demonstrated that WFCOM works pretty good. WFCOM gets its open boundary values from a model called HICOM, which is run by the U.S. Naval Research Lab. And it's a global model, and it has a Gulf of Mexico portion to it. So we input along the open boundary what's happening in the deeper Gulf of Mexico. And by doing that, we can actually downscale from the deep ocean right across the continental shelf and into the major estuaries. For Tampa Bay, in particular, we want an even higher resolution so that we can include the shipping channel with high resolution, all of the inlets that connect Tampa Bay and the Intracoastal Waterway and Sarasota Bay with the adjacent Gulf of Mexico. And we also want to include Sarasota Bay because it does communicate with Tampa Bay. And as you see, it's really part of that system. It's not as if you have a separate Sarasota Bay. There's one large Tampa Bay vicinity estuary that has the Barrier Islands, the Intracoastal Waterway behind them, the main body of Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay, and also the Manatee River. And so if you, as you go to the right in that set of plots, you see blow-ups of the resolution that we have in certain portions of the bay. So the upper right-hand panel, for example, shows a blow-up of the main shipping channel where we have 20-meter resolution. So we can actually resolve the main shipping channel fairly well. Just to the left of that, you see a blow-up by Blind Pass. And so you can see, and John's Pass, so you can see how we can resolve those inlets very well. In fact, all of the inlets are resolved. The lower right-hand panel, you can see North Pass into Sarasota Bay, Longboat Pass, and while it's not included, a little farther down, we have Big Sarasota Pass. So all the major connections of Sarasota Bay with the adjacent ocean are included. And you can see the communication between Sarasota Bay and Tampa Bay. So the idea was to be able to actually model the entire estuarine system in a fairly, in a nice way. Now, along the open boundary of this Tampa Bay model that we call the Tampa Bay Coastal Ocean Model, TBCOM, we get those open boundary values from WFCOM. So the idea then is now we downscale from the deep ocean across the entire shelf and into Tampa Bay with very high resolution, getting everything that's forcing Tampa Bay. So the full coastal ocean forcing, as well as the river inflows and what's happening locally in the bay. And as you'll see as I go through, that's really very important. You know, you really, if you don't do that, you have an incomplete model. You're not looking at everything that's going on, driving the circulation in the near shore and resulting in water flowing in and out of Tampa Bay and what that water may or may not contain. All right, so that's kind of the rationale behind it and how we've set the model up. So how do we run it? Well, we use NOAA winds, their North American mesoscale model output, which is a Nowcast forecast model. For surface heat flux, we also use what comes out of NOAA NAM, but we recognize that there are errors in that. So to maintain sea surface temperature close to what it really should be, we relax the modeled temperature to an observed temperature. It's a form of data assimilation that's generally used. We get the sea surface temperature observations from a NASA product. We get our river discharges from USGS. And as I said, we get our open boundary values from WFCOM. And those open boundary values include the tides. WFCOM in turn gets its open boundary values from the NRL HICOM, and that includes tides and all the deep ocean forcing that may be occurring, like how the loop current impinges upon the West Florida continental shelf slope, and that's important. So we have that in there as well. For initial conditions, the way we start the model is we got values of temperature and salinity for Tampa Bay from WFCOM. This is important because it takes a while for the density field to adjust. So for example, if we started TBCOM, let's say a constant salinity, it would take many months before the salinity adjusted to the fresh water that's flowing into the bay from the river. So by already having that from a long-term WFCOM run, we were able to initialize the model with a density field that was already adjusted, and we can just continue along the way with that. So that's how we initialize it. And then in a Nowcast forecast manner, each day we reinitialize it with the previous day and to do our forecast. So this is kind of how the scheme operates in the Nowcast forecast. So for a run today, the first day is going to be a hindcast from yesterday, and then we'll get 3.5 days of forecast. And then for tomorrow, what we produced today would begin the hindcast, and then we'd have a new 3.5 day forecast. And so each day this thing progresses along, and that's how we produce it. So every day you get 4.5 days worth of model output, the first day being a hindcast and 3.5 days being a forecast. NOAA has been experimenting with longer-term forecasts. So eventually, if we want to, we can do longer-term forecasts as well. But so far, we're sticking with this. Okay, and as far as public access goes, TBCOM continues to run. It's run now for over 2 years in this Nowcast forecast mode. And each day there are 2 products that are on the internet, publicly available. The first one shows hourly surface currents and sea level, and there's the website. And the second one is used for red tide tracking. We do that joint with FWC, and that's also on the internet every day. I'll show you examples of these. And we have published some of this work already in refereed professional journals. That's important because it's a way of veracity testing. Reviewers tend to be rather critical, and so if something is obviously wrong with the models, they'll let us know. So the idea of publishing in refereed journals is actually a very important thing. And so there are 2 papers, actually 3 papers that are already published. 2 specifically on the model we're using. The other one was an application of the model to another project on mounting a GPS on a spar buoy to look at seafloor geodesy. So, and of course, TBCOM is the subject of Jing Chen's doctoral dissertation, which is nearing completion. Okay, so here's 2 examples of surface currents and sea level taken from the internet. And what I'm showing you are forecasts for tomorrow, 3/17, that were produced yesterday on 3/15. And so the left-hand panel is just a snapshot of an outgoing tide. The times are all UTC. So 12 o'clock UTC, I guess, is 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So if you want to go boating, there you are at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And then if you stick around for a while, actually, this is even prior to that. So this would be 2 a.m. tomorrow morning, the incoming tide. Yeah, I think I'll stay in bed. But if you want to go out, there's there's your currents. Now, I know these currents are pretty accurate because I have a sailboat and I like to sail in that part of the world. And if you look on the right-hand panel on the incoming tide, you see a current that kind of loops around to the north and then heads back south and comes in very strongly through that opening. So when I'm sailing my boat and I'm not paying attention, all of a sudden I'll come to a screeching halt. You know, I'll start going 3 knots instead of 5 knots, and I'll say, I must have forgotten how to sail. So then I get my iPhone out and I call up this website and I look at it and I go, I still know how to sail. It's just there's a 1.5 knot current in my face. So that's quite real. I mean, I've gone through that enough times that I believe it. And my hull speed on my sailboat is 7 knots. So I've come in Southwest Pass on several occasions, and all of a sudden I'm going 8.5 knots. And why? Well, because you see there's a 1.5 knot carrying you in there. So these plots are quite nice and quite real and quite useful to anybody that goes boating in the Tampa Bay area. The other thing that you observe is that the effects of the Tampa Bay mouth on the adjacent barrier islands extends quite a bit north and south of the Tampa Bay mouth. And so I know there have been attempts to model what goes on in inlets by putting a high resolution, very small regional model around the inlet, which does not include what's going on at the mouth of Tampa Bay. And those models are clearly in error because what goes on at the mouth of Tampa Bay, as I said, is fairly far reaching. All right, so that's an example of products that are presently being served to the public. We also have this red tide project that I said is joint with FWC. And so every day we put out a set of trajectories of where red tide as observed will go over the next 3.5 days. And these are examples from September of 2018. If you recall, we had a horrendous red tide that year. Pinellas County did a wonderful job cleaning up the beaches. And I was told that Kelly Levy was using this product on a regular basis to help think about how to position the cleanup assets. And so it's already had that application. I guess it's difficult for the public to look at a plot like this, all these squiggly lines. So on Wednesday and Friday, we put out a user-friendly product that just color codes certain portions of the beach as being regions where we think that red tide will be kind of nasty. And so red is very high and orange is medium and so on. And so there was a lot of use of this product throughout that 2018 red tide event. And we got phone calls every day, by individuals as well as reporters trying to get information on where things would go. And Hillsborough County EPC set up a group that had weekly briefings, and they were using this product in their weekly briefings as well. This is what it looks like right now. And there is no red tide, fortunately, but you still see these black lines. They all originate at an X, and then they show where a particle would go carried by the currents over that 4.5 day period, the 1 day of hindcast and 3.5 days of forecast. And what I want to call your attention to is right inside Tampa Bay, where all the squiggly lines go back and forth. Obviously, those are the tidal excursions back and forth. we have a lot more, I'm told there are a lot more people leaping off the Skyway Bridge than is publicized. And so if there's ever a search and rescue operation, this is readily available to anybody on the internet to assist with such a search and rescue operation. If we ever have a harmful spill in the bay again, this is all available publicly on the internet and can be used. And these, again, are produced on a daily basis, whether or not there's a red tide out there. So if you just see a black line, it's just a simulated particle. If you see color coding, it corresponds to some observation of Corona brevis. All right, let's talk about how this model works. Is it any good? The first real test of it was Hurricane Irma. And the model had just started running in an Nowcast forecast manner. And so we had our trial by fire, so to speak. So what you see on the right-hand set of panels are comparisons between sea level at various locations: St. Petersburg, Clearwater, McKay Bay Entrance, Old Port Tampa, and Port Manatee, from top to bottom. The ordinate is height in meters, and you're looking at several days from Jing likes to do this backwards, so I always get confused, but it's all in September from the 8th through the 12th. Okay, so the green line is the tide prediction. The blue line is the observation at the tide gauge, and the dotted red line is our model simulation. Now, I have to admit we cheated just a wee bit. The way we cheated is we first ran the model with the winds provided to us by NOAA, and we got a very similar result, except we didn't set sea level down quite as much as what was observed. But what we also observed, because there are some wind measurements, is that the NOAA winds were underestimating the observed winds by a factor of 1.6. So that's from actual observations. So we reran the model by just jacking the winds up in magnitude by a factor of 1.6. And sure enough, we matched the observations very, very well. So the timing and all that was fine with the NOAA winds, but the magnitude was off by a little bit. Well, what you see is before Irma went through, we're matching the tides very, very well. And then as Irma came through, sea level dropped like a stone. And as you'll see in a minute, portions of the bay became dry. And that was a fairly well-established observation. And once the storm passed, sea level went back to what it had been doing previously. So our trial by fire was a very satisfying one. This is kind of what happened as Irma passed through. First, it skirted along the northern coast of Cuba. It passed the Keys as a Category 4 storm. Made landfall in the U.S. a second time around Naples, and then decided to move up the center of the state. By the time it got to us, it had been reduced to a Category 1 storm. And that was kind of a stretch, because I don't think we ever saw hurricane winds in the Tampa Bay region. The storm was fairly broad, and if you looked at the magnitude of the winds over the ocean, because it really did extend into the Atlantic and into the Gulf of Mexico, there were Category 1 storm winds over water in both the Atlantic and the Gulf. But fortunately for us in the Tampa Bay region, we had much smaller winds, but nonetheless, we had pretty strong winds. And the right-hand set of panels gives the sea level. And so if we start in the upper left, which was September 10th, 2400 UTC. You can see that at that time, the winds were to the south along the coast and over the bay. And water had already left Tampa Bay. All those white areas in Hillsborough Bay and Old Tampa Bay, those are actually areas where the bay dried out. There was no water there. So it's not a color coding issue. It's just there wasn't water there. And if you move to the right, that's 2 hours later. And the bay had emptied out even a little bit more. The winds are still out of the north. And then 2 hours after that, that's when the maximum drying of the bay had occurred. And sea levels, the winds are still blowing out of the north, and they increased a little bit. And then just a few hours later, so 6 hours later, the winds had, the storm had passed us to the north. The winds are now coming in from the west, and the bay filled right back up again. So you can see all those white areas are now covered by red. And red is an elevation of sea level, blue is a decrease in sea level. So, we actually have a really good rendition of what happened in Tampa Bay as the storm went by. And I have to say that in order to get the drying, actually to even model the estuary under conditions like this, you have to have flooding and drying capabilities. Otherwise, the model blows up. The simulation just would stop, because once you dry out a cell that's supposed to be wet, if the model doesn't know how to deal with that, then the model is not going to run. And so this model does have flooding and drying capabilities, and consequently, we were able to do that. Okay, well, so once you have a model like this, you can ask some interesting questions. So if so much water left Tampa Bay, you might want to ask the question, well, where did it leave from? And alternatively, what water stayed in the bay? And so the upper left-hand panel is an experiment where we salted the bay with a bunch of particles in the model, of course, simulated particles, and we tracked them. And it turns out where it says left, that's the portion of the bay where the water left the bay. And then where it says stayed, well, those waters up there stayed in the bay. And so the other panels are an attempt at kind of demonstrating that. So the middle panel on the top shows all the trajectories for particles that remained in the bay. So they moved back and forth quite a bit, but they didn't leave. Whereas the upper right-hand panel, those are the particles that actually left the bay. And not only did they leave the bay, they didn't come back in. They just got shifted far to the south. So all of that water, all of those particles and all the water associated with those particles literally left the bay and said goodbye. And whatever was in that water also said goodbye. So it was a major flushing event for Tampa Bay. Now, 4 hours later, as I showed you previously, the water came back in. So where did it come from? So we put a bunch of particles outside the bay. That's the bottom left-hand panel. And there's a ellipse, a red ellipse, surrounding some of those. Those are the ones that came back in the bay. Everything else went south. And so the water that refilled the bay came from a very restricted place. The middle panel shows you how that happened. The black lines are particles at the surface. They didn't go back in the bay. The red lines are the particles near the bottom, and those are the ones that came into the bay. And then in the far right-hand panel, we exclude the particles that came back in the bay, just left the ones there so you can see of the particles that didn't go back in the bay. And so the majority of that water from north of Tampa Bay did not re-enter the bay. It just went to the south. The ones near the surface went offshore. It was an upwelling, favorable wind. The ones near the bottom just tracked along the shore, with the exception of the few that came back in, shown in the middle panel. So if you're interested in bay ecology, interested in knowing where things come from and where they go to, you need a model like this. And so that was a nice demonstration, I thought. All right, well, what happens under more typical conditions? Does the model work? So here's an example comparing sea level at 5 different stations from St. Petersburg to Port Manatee. The red line is the Tampa Bay Coastal Ocean Model simulation, and the observation is the blue line. And the only adjustment we did for the red line is atmospheric pressure adjustment, what we call the inverted barometer effect. And you can see that these two lines overlay very, very nicely. And we can quantify that, that fidelity by looking at RMS errors and correlation coefficients. And so here's an example for 4 stations: St. Petersburg, Clearwater, McKay Bay, which is the northern part of Hillsborough Bay, and Port Manatee. The correlation coefficients with tides, so everything included, is 0.9, and the RMS errors are between 10 and 12 centimeters. 12 centimeters is a little less than a half a foot. And then if you remove the tides and just look at the correlations with the non-tidal flow, you can see that the correlation coefficient drops down to a little over 0.8. And the RMS error doesn't really drop that much. It's still 7 to 8 centimeters. What that says is that the RMS error is primarily due to the non-tidal up and down of sea level versus the tidal. The tides are being done very well. The non-tidal is where we have an issue. And we understand where that error comes from. It comes from the fact, as I alluded to earlier with Hurricane Irma, the NOAA North American mesoscale forecast winds over water underestimate the actual wind speeds. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that these numerical weather forecast models assimilate data. They don't just run all by themselves. They're constrained by actual observations. Most of the observations are over land versus over water. Very few observations over water. And so if your data assimilation is biased by land-based stations, we know that just because of friction over land, the winds over land are weaker than the winds over water. And consequently, the NOAA forecast winds over the ocean, over the coastal ocean, underestimate the actual winds. And there's a fix for that. The cure is simply put more buoys offshore with anemometers on them so that the agency will have more data points over water to assimilate into their model. And it's been a hard sell because I guess buoys are considered to be expensive, so they don't want to put them out. But if we're really serious about numerical weather forecasting for the coastal ocean and driving coastal ocean models better so that we have better ecological models, well, the weak link is the winds that's forcing the ocean models. And so this is a kind of a call for making more of those observations. All right, let's look at the actual tidal constituents. So the 4 principal tidal constituents for Tampa Bay are the M2, the S2, the O1, and the K1. And this is a tidal analysis of the observed tides and the modeled tides. And you can see that the errors in amplitude between the observation and the model for the tidal constituents is at worst 3 centimeters, typically more, in the order of 1 or less. So we're doing a really good job of getting the tides, the amplitude of the tides. There's a little more error in the phase than I would like. It turns out the numbers look small, but 0.07 is almost 3/4 of an hour. So the phase differences for tidal constituents are off by anywhere from a half hour to 3/4 of an hour. And there's really nothing we could do about it presently in TBCom, because we're actually getting our tidal forcing from the HICOM. And HICOM is it's a global model with a Gulf of Mexico portion. And they've done, I think a masterful job of getting the tides fairly correct, but you still have these little adjustments that could be made, but we don't run that model, so we can't make them. In our previous rendition of our high resolution Tampa Bay model, before we made it a Nowcast forecast model, so before we nested it into WFCOM, the previous version, we input the tidal constituents ourselves along the open boundary, and we were able to adjust those a little bit so that our tidal comparisons were better than these. The phases we had down to a few minutes, and the amplitude, about the same as this, maybe a little bit better. But the trade-off then is if you do that, you can't do all the other things we can now do, like talk about where the water goes and where the water comes from and how the bay communicates with the adjacent ocean. And so everything has a trade-off. And I think this is, these numbers are still pretty good in the light of that trade-off. You've seen estuary models where somebody will just use, and this is typically done by engineers, they'll just take a tide gauge at the open boundary and run the estuary with the tide gauge at the open boundary. And you know what? You almost get perfect tides. Well, what can you do with that model? You have no way of looking at the exchange of fluid in and out. If you have an oil spill, you have no way of tracking that oil. If you have a search and rescue operation, what are you going to do? You don't have any coastal ocean, so you're kind of screwed. So, everything has a trade-off, and what we're trying to do is give a as holistic approach as possible to modeling Tampa Bay with everything that's forcing the bay in the model. And I still think we're doing a pretty good job, even though these phase differences are a little bit bigger than I'm happy about. But until the tides are adjusted in HICOM, which they may be at some point, we're kind of stuck with this. Okay, let's talk about the winds a little bit, because we really learned something in this exercise. And so what you're looking at are just scatter plots of observed wind speeds and NOAA model wind speeds. And let's just look at one of them. Look at Middle Tampa Bay. So it's the middle panel on the far right. And what you see is that there's a disparity between the magnitude observed versus the magnitude that we get from NOAA NAM. And so the observed winds are just bigger. And the factor was about 1.6. That's the correlation. The amplitude of the correlation is 1.55. And so we decided that to get better results for Tampa Bay, instead of using the NAM winds, let's use the Middle Tampa Bay winds, because they don't vary that much over the bay. And so we started forcing TBCom with the Middle Tampa Bay winds, and then outside the bay, we kind of slowly ramp the winds up to what the observation suggests it ought to be. So we kind of have a hybrid wind forcing to get results that we think are the most realistic. But this is a really telling plot that came out of this project, and that is, again, if you want to have the right winds to force ocean models or even estuarine models, you got to recognize that the land-based winds that are assimilated into the models are too weak, and therefore the forecast winds are too weak. And we know what to fix it. So we just need more observations of wind. Okay, well, so let's take a look at what's going on in Tampa Bay and how well we're doing. I've already showed you tide comparisons, so the tidal current comparisons are just as good. So let's look at the non-tidal part. And so this is a comparison for a 4-month period of time between TBCOM modeled currents at the Port Manatee station. So there's an acoustic Doppler current profiler at that station. So we downloaded these data from NOAA, and we did a direct comparison between, well, we filtered out the tides, and then did a direct comparison between the non-tidal currents observed and modeled over this 4-month period of time. Let's start at the bottom. So the point that we have closest to the bottom in the model and in the observation at the same distance off the bottom, they compare extremely well. And what you see is that there's a net inflow into Tampa Bay in the main shipping channel at that location. And that's expected for an estuarine circulation, where the non-tidal circulation by gravitational convection has an inflow in the bottom and an outflow near the surface. And that's exactly what we model, and the amplitudes are pretty good, and the the fluctuations all look to be fairly coherent. In fact, the correlation coefficient is 0.9. If you look in the middle of the water column, again, we have a very good comparison. Correlation coefficient is down a little bit, 0.8, but it still looks very similar. And we still see this inflow of fluid, both in the observation and in the model simulation. The closest bin in that acoustic Doppler current profiler at the Port Manatee station is at a depth of 4.6 meters. So we sampled our model at that same depth, and again, they look pretty good. The correlation coefficient is down a little bit because we're now in kind of the transition region between where the flow has a net outflow of fluid versus a net inflow of fluid. And if we go higher up in the water column, you would see that net outflow of fluid. We definitely see it in the model. There's no observation to compare it with, but it all makes sense. And so, the argument is we're getting the tides about right. We're getting the wind-induced circulation about right when we elevate the wind magnitude a little bit. I'm sorry, when we use the actual winds in the bay to drive the model. And we're getting the gravitational convection right. That's critical because that is what determines the ecology of an estuary. It's really the low frequency variations caused by the density differences from the head of the bay to the mouth of the bay that determines the real movement of materials throughout the estuary. So we were quite pleased with this. We mentioned that on a related project, we put an observation at the mouth of at the beginning of Passagrille Inlet. There's a Coast Guard tower a little bit offshore, and we mounted observations there. So this is the same kind of format as I showed you earlier, a near surface comparison between the observed currents and the model currents, a mid-depth comparison, and a near bottom comparison. And again, they look pretty good. You know, all the fluctuations kind of track one another, and in this case, there really isn't much of a mean flow. But all right, so that's the station a little bit offshore. And then we have another. Whoops, what am I missing here? Manatee. Ah, I must have inadvertently left a slide out because I had another one for a station which is on the 25-meter isobath off of Sarasota, and that looked pretty good too. But I must have chopped it because I'm now on to Lignac, which is a French term for some extras. And so we're gonna give you a little bit extra, just like you would get if you went to New Orleans, where they like to use this term. So we did a few more things that we didn't propose to do, but wound up doing, which demonstrates, you know, why this was a good project to fund. Oh, here it is. Okay, I just put the other one in the wrong place. All right. Anyway, this is the comparison near surface, mid depth, and near bottom for our station C10, which is on the 25-meter isobath offshore of Sarasota. And again, the comparisons are pretty good. There's one weird thing which I haven't been able to figure out. And if I look at the near surface one in particular, there's a somewhat of a mismatch between the angle observed and the angle modeled. And this is kind of bothered us now for years because we saw this in WFCOM as well. And actually this is pretty close to the open boundary, so it might simply be coming from WFCOM. But every other station that we've looked at offshore, the angles match up a lot better than this one station. And so I'm thinking that there might be some disparity in the bottom bathymetry that is published and therefore used in our model versus what it may actually be, because currents like to follow lines of constant depth. Anyway, so this is something we'll be looking into further. And but I always thought this was fascinating. I've seen this for a long time, so it's not an issue with the observation, and so I still need to find out why that slight angle, that deviation is there. Okay, now we can go on to this. Oh, we got a phone call a year or so ago from police department, Longboat Key, and they said that they found a body on the beach. Oh gosh, this is in the wrong place. Anyway, the body was right over here. That thing should be here. And the question is, was it foul play or not? You know, why is the body there? Because the last time that person was seen, it was seen right up here off of there's a marina by Cortez Causeway. And so the person was seen there that evening, and then the next day, the body was found just on the ocean side, just north of New Pass. So, you know, the neat thing about TVCOM is it has such high resolution. We include the inlets. And so the question is, could somebody have fallen off their boat or whatever? We don't know the origin of it, but could somebody have found themselves in the water, be carried to the south out through Longboat Pass, and then down the coast to be deposited on the beach by by Newcast. So we did a simulation for the police department, and sure enough, we can account for the movement of that body um, by the tides and the winds that were observed at that time. So we wound up helping the coroner's office, and they didn't find any foul play. And this kind of suggested that it was just a terrible accident, and foul play wasn't involved. We can also do things like in other parts of Tampa Bay. Here's an example of looking at, people like to use Courtney Campbell Causeway for boating and swimming. I don't know why I wouldn't want to swim there, but anyway, what would happen to a particle that was in the water right near that causeway under typical tide and wind conditions that occur there. So we did an experiment, and what I contend is that if there was a search and rescue operation, you could use TBCOM to determine where things would go. And the neat thing is, TBCOM, you'll notice it has there are two openings in the causeway, not just one. A model has to have high resolution to include the causeway and to include the opening. And it turns out both of these openings are very important in directing the flow. There's some controversy about a sewage treatment plant, which is on the west side of that causeway, and this model would be very effective at tracing where sewage spill might go. In fact, you can make that argument for every sewage treatment plant in Pinellas County and Hillsborough County. And so this is a wonderful tool for doing that if anybody's interested. It also turns out, I think I can say this now, there was a murder investigation for which we had done this a long time ago, and that's been adjudicated. So I'm not saying anything I shouldn't say, but again, it was another forensic study. Okay, so one more thing we did that we hadn't proposed. Hillsborough County, they have a wastewater treatment plant that dumps treated water that's not needed at that pink dot where it says AWTP. And as part of a revision to how they deal with their water treatment, they want to stop dumping water there. And the question is, will that have any environmental impact? So we were asked to determine what the change might be in salinity and currents in Hillsborough Bay in the event that they turn that spigot off. And so we went through this project with them and demonstrated, as you can see in the right-hand panels, of surface and bottom salinity and surface and bottom currents, that basically the consequence is so minuscule it wouldn't matter. So those are some of the extra things we did. As I said earlier, there are a number of publications, and I included in that this Hillsborough Bay Inflow Modification Study report that we did for the city of Tampa. And the next thing to come out, and it's almost done, is Jing Chen's PhD dissertation. He's got 6 chapters in it. Each one of these papers will be a chapter, but he also has a very detailed, I just gave you a couple of pieces of it, a very detailed comparison between sea level and currents, comparing TBCOM with actual observations. And that will be a chapter in there as well. So we'll have much better quantitative comparisons once his dissertation is complete. We've given a bunch of conference presentations and talks and webinars, and I've been asked on several occasions to give talks to public groups, so we do that. So we've been fulfilling the public outreach goal of the project. And again, this is where you could find the material that I've talked about. And as far as providing actual model output for agency usage, we have a thread server that actually serves up the actual model simulations. So you can download those and do whatever you want to do with them. And before I close, let me tell you where we're going with this. So we have a couple of new projects. First of all, we're involved with the NOAA IUS program through a group called SOCORA, which is the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association. It's a mouthful. But with SOCORA, we maintain a set of buoys offshore, and we maintain our WFCOM. And so that's going to continue. We anticipate 5 new years of funding that will start in July of this year. So that will continue. And we'll continue running TBCOM as part of that as well. We have a new NOAA project. It's part of a coastal mapping project. And they're also quite interested in coastal inundation and getting very high resolution of flows in the intracoastal waterway. And so our new version of WFCOM has been modified to include the entire intracoastal waterway from Pinellas County down to, I guess, Charlotte County. And we will be providing very high resolution products for that part of the world as well. We've reconfigured our model near the Florida Keys, so we have very high resolution, getting all of the cuts between Florida Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. And we've also run the model up to Biscayne Bay and the Port of Miami. And so all of that will continue as part of both SOCORA and this new NOAA project. With FWC, we have 5 years of red tide work that seems to be funded, and we'll continue working with our partners there. We anticipate adding a biological module once we get the wave part finished. And in the future, we also start to look at sediment transport in a little more detail. And I think there's a hell of a lot to learn about sediment transport for the west coast of Florida. It's about as complicated a coastline as anywhere else, and yet we call it a low energy coast. And so between the tidal currents and the wind-driven currents, there's a hell of a lot to learn, and we're not going to learn it by just looking at each inlet independently, because as I showed earlier, the effects of the major estuaries, which would be Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor, the effects of those estuaries extend pretty far north and south of the actual estuaries themselves. Ecologically, while it doesn't happen all the time, Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor are 2 primary big estuaries on the West Coast. They communicate water. So if you have winds blowing long enough and strong enough, as occurs every now and then, we had hurricane or tropical storm Debbie, I think it was, and we know that water communicated from the Charlotte Harbor to Tampa Bay during Debbie because it sat offshore for a while. Irma, I think we had communication of water there again. And so with high resolution, we can actually begin to address these ecological questions that have vexed us for a long time, as well as the sediment transport questions. So I would say that we thank you very much for this opportunity. I think we built a tool that has some legs, and it's going to run for quite some time. So thank you.